Hey everyone! This is a quick reminder to subscribe and hit that like button. It lets me know that you are enjoying my content. Also, feel free to drop your suggestions for future stories in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and let's dive right in. I always thought my disability made me less of a person, whether it was the pitying looks or the people who saw me as an easy target. I never really understood what was going on in their heads. I wasn't born deaf. The car accident that killed my dad took my hearing with it. I lost the one person who made me feel seen, who taught me everything. My mom? She was still around, but she was something else. A work addict, a money addict, maybe both. Dad used to beg her to spend time with us, and when she didn't, he threatened divorce. Then came the cheating accusations, the fights, the slammed doors, and then he was gone. It took losing him for her to realize what she had. By then, it was too late. She fell into a depression she never climbed out of. Even now, 5 years later, I'd gotten used to being deaf. I was grateful I hadn't been born this way, because at least I could still speak. If I didn't tell people, they never even noticed. Mom took me to expensive doctors and lip-reading lessons, and I adapted. The last few years of high school were rough, though. In our small town, everyone knew about my accident. I hated the attention, the way people stared when I struggled to keep up. Now, I had escaped all that. I was on a college campus, living a normal life. Working at the campus coffee shop, hanging out with coworkers, finally feeling like myself. It was just a regular shift that day, laughing at some dumb joke Rebecca made when I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I pulled it out, an emergency alert. Do not listen to the whispers. I blinked. What? A weird hush fell over the shop. Rebecca and the others had gone quiet, their faces blank as they stared at their phones. My stomach twisted. I looked up, scanning the shop. The entire place had fallen into silence. People hunched over their screens, reading the same alert. A creeping unease crawled up my spine. Then, one by one, their phones slipped from their hands, all at once. A synchronized drop of dozens of phones hitting the ground. Rebecca was completely still. I called her name. No reaction. I waved my hand in front of her face. Nothing. She wasn't blinking. None of them were. I turned, heart pounding, looking at the other students in the cafe. They stood motionless, frozen mid-action. One girl still had a coffee cup halfway to her lips, her fingers locked around it. A guy by the counter held a credit card in mid-air, eyes unblinking, expression blank. They weren't moving. They weren't even breathing. What the hell was happening? Panic surged through me and I took a shaky step back. The silence in the room felt unnatural, like the whole world had been suddenly muted. But I knew that wasn't right. It was more than that. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get out. The moment I stepped outside, I slammed into someone. Hard. I stumbled back, already preparing to apologize, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized they weren't moving either. A guy stood mid-stride, his foot still hovering above the ground like he'd been frozen in time. His phone was on the pavement, his blank face staring straight ahead, mouth slightly parted. I spun around, everywhere. Across the campus lawn, in the pathways, outside buildings, everyone was frozen. Some mid-step, some in conversation, some sitting on benches, their books open on their laps. The entire world had stopped. I let out a choked breath, heart hammering, and then as my vision blurred with tears, I realized something even worse. I was the only one still moving. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, my body just moved. I dodged frozen bodies, stepping over dropped books, spilled coffee cups, abandoned bags. It was like the world had been caught in some horrible glitch, stuck in a moment that would never end. I was the only one left. Tears blurred my vision, but I kept going, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then, a crash. I slammed right into someone. I stumbled back, heart lurching. My first thought, another frozen one. I ran into a statue. But then, movement. She blinked. She breathed. She looked just as terrified as me. She was about my age, sitting on the ground where I had knocked her over. Her dark hair was tangled around her face, her hands gripping a pair of headphones. I knew her. I'd seen her in class before, maybe once or twice in the library. She wasn't frozen. I had never felt such relief in my life. She stood, brushing herself off, then hesitated. Her gaze flickered between me and the motionless bodies all around us. Her breathing was shaky as she gripped her headphones like a lifeline. Then she asked, "How did you do it?" I blinked. "What?" She swallowed hard. "How did you survive? Without..." She lifted her headphones slightly. Oh. It hit me like a brick to the chest. The alert. The one I had read before everything stopped. Do not listen to the whispers. I had never heard them. I was deaf. I forced myself to say it, even though the words felt strange in my mouth. "I'm deaf." Her eyes widened, and for the first time since this nightmare began, someone actually understood something I couldn't. She let out a shaky laugh, rubbing a hand over her face. "Guess it's your lucky day then, huh?" I didn't know what she meant. I didn't know what any of this meant. But before I could ask, she grabbed my wrist. "Come on," she said. "We need to get somewhere safe." I didn't argue, I just followed. She led me across campus, moving fast. We passed more frozen bodies, people stuck in horrifyingly unnatural poses. Mid-run, mid-sentence, some even collapsed on the ground. My stomach twisted. We stopped in front of a dorm building. I recognized it. It was exactly like mine, just reversed. She unlocked the door and motioned for me to go in first. I hesitated, not because I didn't trust her, but because something about walking into a dorm surrounded by frozen bodies felt wrong, like they could somehow still see us. But I stepped inside. She locked the door behind us. I turned to face her. "I'm Nora." It felt stupid to introduce myself in the middle of the apocalypse, but I needed to say something. She let out a soft chuckle, stretching out her hand. "Charlotte." I shook it. Her hand was warm. Human. Real. It made me feel a little less alone. She motioned for me to sit beside her on the bed, then grabbed her laptop. I watched as she typed furiously, opening up a news site. And there it was, the top headline. "Do not listen to the whispers." Charlotte clicked it. The article loaded slowly, the page filled with rushed misspelled words like it had been written in pure panic. We read it together. The whispers started before the alert went out. It was already too late for some people. No one knew where they came from or who was speaking. If you hear them clearly, you freeze. The frozen ones have no pulse. They are, for all intents and purposes, dead. I turned to Charlotte. Tears slid down her cheeks, dripping onto the keyboard. I wanted to hug her, but I wasn't sure if she'd want that. Then suddenly, she dropped the laptop on the bed and wrapped her arms around me. I stiffened, caught off guard, but then I felt it. Her body shaking against mine, her warm breath on my shoulder, the way she clung to me like I was the only real thing left in the world. So I hugged her back. We sat there for minutes, saying nothing. Then she pulled away, wiping her face. "Sorry," she muttered. "I just wasn't ready to read that there, you know." I nodded. I wasn't ready either. But I had a feeling that, no matter what we did, this nightmare wasn't over yet. We sat there for a while, staring at the words on the screen, as if rereading them would somehow make them less real. But the truth was there, spelled out in panicked, desperate words. The frozen ones weren't just unconscious. They weren't just trapped, they were dead. And if we heard the whispers, we would be too. Charlotte sniffed and wiped her face before looking at me. "We need a plan." I nodded, trying to push down the fear clawing its way up my throat. We needed to get to my dorm. Pack. Find a car. Then I could get to my mom. Charlotte didn't argue. She just grabbed her backpack, stuffing a flashlight, some snacks, and a water bottle inside before throwing it over her shoulder. We cracked the door open. The hallway was still, bodies frozen in place, some people mid-stride, others slumped over in doorways. A guy had collapsed onto the floor, his glasses knocked slightly askew, one hand still gripping a textbook. My stomach turned. We moved carefully, stepping over them like statues in a museum. Neither of us spoke. There was something deeply wrong about making noise here, even though I wouldn't have heard it. When we finally stepped outside, the sun was just beginning to set. That's when I noticed it. Something was off. The frozen people, they looked different. It was subtle. A twitch of the lips, the way their eyelids drooped just slightly, like the weight of time was wearing them down. Charlotte grabbed my wrist, her grip tightening. I followed her gaze to a man standing in the courtyard. He wasn't moving, just like the others, phone still clutched in his hand, blank, frozen face. But when I blinked, he was gone. My breath caught. No, that wasn't possible. I had just seen him. He had been right there. I turned to Charlotte. Her face had gone pale. She lifted a trembling hand, pointing at something beyond me. I turned. The man was back, standing further away now, facing us, watching. I grabbed Charlotte's arm, my pulse hammering in my ears. We need to go, now. We ran. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was happening to the others. We reached my dorm and slammed the door shut behind us, locking it immediately. Charlotte braced her hands against the wall, catching her breath. I wiped sweat from my forehead and crossed the room, yanking open my closet. I didn't have much, but I grabbed what I could. A change of clothes, protein bars, my water bottle, my phone charger. The air inside the dorm felt thick, suffocating. I went to the window, pulling it open just enough to let in fresh air. And then, I saw him again. The same man from the courtyard, standing outside my window. Phone to his ear, frozen in mid-stride. I yanked the curtains closed so fast my hands shook. Charlotte touched my shoulder, and I jumped so violently that my back slammed against the wall. I had known she was right there, and still, I jumped. Her expression was tight, anxious, her eyes wide with fear. She lifted a finger to her lips. Then she turned me around to face the window again. The curtains were closed, but the streetlights outside cast faint shadows through the fabric. The man's silhouette was still there. I held my breath. Then, suddenly, the silhouette moved. Charlotte tensed beside me. I looked at her, trying to read her face. She mouthed something. I focused hard, watching the movement of her lips. He walked away. My stomach twisted. That wasn't possible. They were supposed to be frozen. I whispered as best as I could, my voice shaky. She mouthed it again. He walked away. Then her head snapped to the side so fast that I barely saw it. She heard something. Her body went rigid. She turned back to me, her lips forming words in silent terror. They are walking. I felt the blood drain from my face. I crouched down, pressing my head against the floor so I could see under the door. And what I saw, feet, moving, not just one pair, dozens, all walking. The frozen were moving, and we were trapped inside. We didn't move, not for a long time. Charlotte was still crouched beside me, her breathing shallow, her hands clenched into tight fists. We watched in horrified silence as the frozen walked past the door, their footsteps light but steady, an eerie procession of the dead. They weren't aimless. They were looking for something, for someone. The thought made my stomach twist into knots. We waited until the last shadow disappeared down the hallway, until the shuffle of movement faded into nothing. Then, Charlotte let out a breath, her shoulders trembling as she turned to me. We need to go. We can't stay here another night. She was right. At sunrise, the frozen would return to their places, locked back into their unnatural stillness. That was our only chance. I packed the rest of my bag in record time, shoving in anything useful, extra clothes, food, the pocket knife I had kept since high school. Charlotte double-checked the lock on the door, pressing her ear against it before nodding at me. The world outside was motionless again. The man I had seen the night before stood exactly where I had last spotted him, his phone still to his ear, his eyes blank. I tried not to look too long. We stepped over frozen bodies as we made our way to the parking lot. The early morning light cast long, unnatural shadows across the pavement, stretching the frozen ones into grotesque figures against the ground. Then, a car. A silver sedan parked near the dorm entrance, its driver frozen inside, the young man, hand still reaching for the glove compartment. Charlotte pointed. "Look." The keys were in the ignition. We didn't hesitate. I yanked the door open, my hands shaking as I unbuckled the driver's seatbelt. He was heavier than I expected, dead weight, his body eerily stiff as we pulled him out of the car. It felt wrong to move him. He was dead. But he wasn't. I shoved the thought aside and slid into the driver's seat, Charlotte scrambling into the passenger side. I gripped the wheel, taking a deep breath. Then I turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, and for the first time in hours I felt a spark of hope. Then a man jumped in front of the car. I slammed my foot on the brake, the tires screeching. Charlotte let out a sharp gasp beside me. I barely had time to process before the man lunged, yanking the door open and dragging me out of the car. I hit the pavement hard, my vision spinning. Before I could react, something cold pressed against my neck. A knife. The man hovered over me, his face twisted in desperation. His bloodshot eyes darted wildly, his breathing ragged. "Give me the car," he snarled, "or I'll slit your throat." Charlotte was frozen beside the car, her hands raised slightly. I swallowed hard. I wanted to say something. There are 100 other cars. Why ours? But the truth was clear in his eyes. He was terrified. Terrified in the way a cornered animal is terrified. So I nodded. "Take it." He yanked me to my feet, then shoved me backward. Charlotte stumbled back too, her fists clenched. The man slid into the driver's seat. Then, without another word, he sped off, the tires screeching as he disappeared down the road. We stood there, stunned, breathless, watching as our only way out vanished. Charlotte turned to me, her expression unreadable. Then, quietly, she whispered, "We need another car." I nodded, jaw clenched. "We don't have much daylight left." She didn't argue. We turned and started walking. We walked. The sun was getting lower, stretching the shadows of the frozen across the streets. They stood where they had been that morning, locked in their unnatural poses, some mid-step, some frozen in the act of opening car doors, others collapsed on sidewalks like discarded dolls. We needed another car. We checked several vehicles along the road, but they were either locked or useless. Some were empty, their drivers missing. Others had been left running overnight, and their batteries had died. Now I understood why that man had jumped us. We had found a way out, and now we had lost it. Charlotte was tense beside me, scanning every street. The silence was thick, pressing down on us with an unbearable weight. Then she grabbed my wrist, tugging me toward a blue sedan. The driver was a middle-aged man, frozen while looking in the side mirror. Charlotte tried the door. Locked. She let out a frustrated breath and shook her head. I glanced at the man inside. His face was expressionless, his body stiff, but there was something wrong about him. The way his mouth hung slightly open, his lips barely parted, like he had been caught mid-sentence. I looked at Charlotte and shook my head. "Not this one." She understood immediately. We backed away, our pace quickening. Nightfall was coming too fast. We didn't have time. We checked 2 more cars, but one had no keys, and the other was occupied by someone too large for us to move. The sun dipped below the buildings. I turned to Charlotte. "We need to hide." She nodded. The closest building was an office complex, glass doors already half open, as if someone had rushed out and never returned. We slipped inside, moving carefully. The lobby was filled with frozen people mid-stride, others seated at desks, fingers poised over keyboards. I had to force myself to keep moving. We found a janitor's closet down a side hallway, small, cramped, but safe. I closed the door, pressing my back against the wall. Charlotte sank down next to me, pulling her knees to her chest. Then, for the first time since the alert, I let it all crash down on me. I clenched my fists, squeezing my eyes shut. What the hell was happening? Charlotte shifted beside me, and before I knew it, she was wrapping her arms around me, holding me tightly. I hadn't realized I was shaking until then. She didn't say anything. She knew I couldn't hear her anyway. She just held me. I let the tears come, silent and hot, soaking into my sleeves. At some point, I must have drifted off, because when I woke up, my neck hurt, and Charlotte was still next to me, her grip slightly looser. I shook her gently. She stirred, blinking at me groggily. Then I slowly, carefully opened the door. It was still dark outside, but something wasn't right. The moment the door creaked, Charlotte tensed beside me, her body going rigid. And then I saw him. The man who stole our car, standing in the hallway. But now, he was one of them. His head was tilted at a strange angle, his mouth moving silently, as if whispering words I would never hear. Charlotte's fingers dug into my arm. He turned toward us and started walking. Charlotte didn't move. Neither did I. The man who stole our car was one of them now, his body stiff, his head cocked at an unnatural angle, and his lips moving silently. I couldn't hear the whispers, but Charlotte could. She was shaking, her fingers digging into my arm so tightly it almost hurt. He kept coming, slow, deliberate, his blank eyes locked on us. I grabbed Charlotte's hand, trying to pull her back. We had to run. But then, before I could stop her, she broke away from me. She ran, right toward the Frozen. I lunged forward, but she was already too far. The man moved fast, faster than I had ever seen one of them move. He grabbed her by the arm, yanking her back, his mouth still moving, whispering. Charlotte screamed. Then, she stopped. Her body locked into place, her limbs stiff, her face frozen in an expression of terror. She was gone. Just like that. I stumbled backward, shaking my head. No, she had saved me. She had fought for me, and I had let this happen. Tears blurred my vision, but I couldn't stop, not now. The others were moving now, all of them, coming down the hallway, their feet dragging against the floor, their mouths whispering. I turned and ran. The front doors were blocked. Frozen bodies stood in the lobby, facing forward, standing eerily still. But I knew, the moment I got too close, they would move. I turned down a side hall. I sprinted past cubicles and desks, past rows of computers still displaying unfinished emails, half-written messages. A coffee cup sat beside one, steam long gone. I didn't stop until I found another exit. A side door. I shoved it open and stumbled into the night, and right into a sea of Frozen. They were everywhere, lining the sidewalks, standing in the streets, their faces blank, their eyes lifeless. All of them were whispering. They turned toward me at the same time. I bolted. I sprinted down the road, dodging between the statues of the dead, keeping my eyes forward, forcing myself to not look back. I needed a car. I needed to get out of here. I shoved my way toward an old pickup truck parked at the edge of the street. Empty. Keys were in the ignition. I yanked the door open. I climbed inside, slammed the door, turned the key. The engine roared to life. The Frozen turned toward the sound. Then, all at once, they moved. They ran. At me. I floored the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, tires screeching against the pavement. The Frozen lunged at the car, their fingers scraping against the glass, their lips still moving. Then I was through them. I swerved down the street, past the Frozen bodies standing mid-stride, past the empty buildings, past the world that had collapsed around me. I drove for hours, and then, in the distance, I saw it. Home. My mom's house. I slowed the car, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I pulled into the driveway, barely breathing. Then I saw her, standing outside, her phone still in her hand, frozen, just like the rest of them. I sat there, staring, my vision blurred. I was too late.